Welcome, everyone. This is the final roundtable discussion of our networked governance series. This virtual seminar is hosted by the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm Eric Alston, scholar in residence at the University of Colorado Boulder's Lee Business School in the Finance Division. We have with us three of our resident experts from Pitt surrounding questions of digital governance. We have Martin Weiss, Michael Madison, and Marcela Gomez, all going to provide commentary today as kind of a summary wrap-up of this exciting seminar series we've had thus far. I'm also happy to see several of our speakers have joined in for today's talk. So to me, that we will likely hear from them as well. Martin, Michael, or Marcela, do you have anything you'd like to say before we dive in? I was planning on doing a quick review of all the topics we've seen, as well as kind of what I see as a taxonomy of the topics covered vis-a-vis digital governance. So this seminar most broadly is, how do we govern ourselves digitally? And you might have noticed the slight pivot in the title, which is, how might we govern ourselves digitally? Because a lot of the topics we've discussed thus far are very much on the frontier of digital governance, whether it's transformative applications of blockchain to new areas of networked governance online. I think blockchain has proven itself vis-a-vis discrete units of value on specific blockchain architecture or networks with a specific blockchain architecture. But what other applications might there be? But we also considered online communities more generally, both from the lens of blockchain, but also from a more general lens of why are they all semi-feudal dictatorships? And so finally, we considered very interesting, I would say, kind of edge markets that might become the new standard, such as the grid and transactive energy, like we heard from Lynn Kiesling last week. And so the three kind of overarching areas I saw as our speakers touching upon were cryptocurrencies specifically, the promise of blockchain governance generally, as well as the implications for all of digital governance writ large of the technological change we have seen since the internet revolution and onwards. So we first heard from Will Luther considering Bitcoin's payment structure in particular. And he was correcting what he considers to be a common misconception surrounding Bitcoin. His argument was it's a distributed, not a decentralized payment mechanism. This has deep implications for securities law, and I'll get to both Professor Werbach's and Professor Wright's contributions in our seminar shortly. But we then also heard from Professor Lawrence White, who's written about competitive units of account since long before the internet was even a widespread term used in any households. So he updated his analysis saying, how can we understand these new digital units of value? Are they likely to become the next unit of account? And what are the competitive forces that shape outcomes for those networks? Those are the speakers that I saw as specifically focusing on cryptocurrencies as opposed to blockchain technology more generally. Blockchain technology and its disruptive potential, its transformative potential, was something we heard a lot about. We heard from Kevin Werbach, who's actually joining us today, and about both the promise and the challenge of blockchain governance. I thought his talk title, or the material surrounding his talk, the Siren Song, was quite apt in describing ways in which we can bind our hands ex ante to credibly commit to mutually distrusting or mutually unknown participants on a particular network. And so what aspects of our interactions, what aspects of our economic transactions can we program ex ante? Can we think through all of the relevant downstream contingencies? Those are potentially the applications most tractable to governance by blockchain. We also heard from Aaron Wright, who had similar, related, but distinct points to make about the specific legal implications of different blockchain facilitated transactions. How many of our contracts are tractable to automated execution? And in what ways can we, which areas should we look for these transformations to be occurring in the coming years? We also heard from Jason Potts, and he's well known for his both intellectual contributions, but advocacy surrounding the transformative potential of blockchain. He's the director of the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. And I thought one of the particular points he made that may be worth returning to today is this interesting synergy between our institutions and our dominant forms of technology. And so his prediction was much of the law and regulation that we see today is based on outdated technology surrounding how we associate. And I saw an interesting kind of a foreshadowing of Leah Palagashvili's talk in particular. She was talking about the incredibly transformative potential of smart contracts for less, the gig economy, for less centralized, less traditional firm-based structures. And we also heard from Nick Cowan, who similarly, he was focusing on a lot of the interesting DeFi applications that we're currently seeing. So if you've heard Uniswap, SushiSwap, BurgerSwap, any of those things, these are all potentially transformative DeFi applications of blockchain. Then we pivoted and sort of considered digital governance more generally. And I would consider Nick Cowan's piece as partly blockchain focused and partly generally just focusing on the increasingly decentralized nature of online communities. But we also heard from Nathan Schneider, who I think is very optimistic about digital governance, but has very interesting things to say when he considers the nature of most online communities today. Are they just feudalism? Are they just kind of a weird dictatorship? And how might we govern ourselves differently in the digital realm was the question I saw Nathan Schneider posing in particular. Then we heard from Lynn Kiesling, transactive energy applications and modernizing our grid in, to me, fascinating ways that may allow us to harness greater efficiencies than we realized were possible from the green energy revolution that's taking place all around us. I just had a summer lunch seminar, or not a summer, a lunch seminar for the finance division in which we examined coal plant closures. As these large scale forms of generation click off and individual forms of energy generation click on, what is that economy going to look like? What changes need to occur to the grid and what changes need to occur at the consumer level for that to become possible? To me, that's one of the more exciting topics we touched upon, and it would be happy to return to that further in the discussion today. And finally, we heard from Leah Palagashvili saying we increasingly have independent contractors performing a variety of services in our economy as compared to the traditional structure of the firm. If we consider technology is drastically reducing transaction costs, and we buy Coase's, Williamson's, the many scholars' arguments surrounding the firm as a nexus for reducing transaction costs, if technology reduces those transaction costs, perhaps the structures of the firm that we've come to take for granted as part and parcel of modern market economies, perhaps those structures will look considerably different or will be gone altogether in certain industries. Think of Uber, think of the increasing prevalence of delivery services right now. I can get things via delivery in my own town that were not possible prior to the pandemic. And so I think Leah's talk is particularly germane considering the forcing nature of this pandemic for changing our economic interactions. And so that's Eric's quick rundown of the awesome set of speakers we've had thus far this semester. So does anyone, Martin, Michael, Marcela, do you have any comments you want to add to my quick and dirty summary?
I think you've done a great job of sort of providing a broad perspective and structure to the series of speakers that we had. You know, I think when we conceived the seminar series at the beginning, we were thinking a lot about blockchain governance because that's, we've had a couple of papers in this space, but we've I think we've really moved beyond that. And I guess I tend to take a historical view of a lot of these kinds of things, and I start looking at what's happened to the internet too, because back, for those of you who've been around long enough and you remember the time when the internet was the new shiny thing, we thought about that being a totally decentralized approach to governance. And guess what happened? We were not that way. I mean, in fact, we tried to take that approach to governing the internet into a kind of a very public, engaging, inclusive approach with the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers. That's probably the best example that we have of that. And I won't, it's hard to say that it's a failure, but it's hard to also say that it's a roaring success, because what they've been able to accomplish has been slow and perhaps has been underwhelming. And we continue to see pressures from traditional governments and intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations, who are trying to extract, to kind of pull governance of the internet into their domains. And I just kind of, I guess perhaps it's because I read Kevin's book very carefully early on, and the musings that we've had in our own groups talking about blockchain governance, that it seems inevitable that we're going to have to interact with the existing systems, and the question is how to do that, and how do we preserve the essence of the thing while we try to incorporate it into our daily lives.
No, I completely agree. It especially in the blockchain realm. I'm on the optimistic side though, which is to say, I think individuals who are engaged in groups like this one at the early phases of the internet had an outsized influence on subsequent outcomes, which is it was the early tinkerers and some of the most optimistic individuals who ultimately played important roles in shaping the governance that did emanate from governments. And so a point that we've emphasized in our paper that's forthcoming on Notre Dame's Journal of Emerging Technologies, Martin Ilya Murtazashvili, another associate director of the Center for Governance and Markets, and Wilson Law, our argument is governance by government is one really important form of governance that individuals shouldn't ignore, even if they view it with skepticism or outright distaste. Because there's often a conflation in the decentralize everything blockchain realm to say, we have avoided the need for governments altogether. I would argue, well, if you're looking at the Bitcoin network, you've avoided a certain class of payment disputes quite well. So you've avoided the need for governance of that class of payment disputes, let alone government intervention for resolving the worst edge cases of those types of payment disputes. For those of you who haven't read the Bitcoin white paper, it's all about how can we create a digital token that has all of the desirable attributes of cash, including no chargebacks, no centralized third-party mediator that says this merchant didn't actually provide this service, so we're reversing this charge. And so I think an important overarching lesson surrounds which aspects of governance do technological innovation, especially the technological innovations we've considered, remove altogether? Which aspects of governance do they change? And which aspects of traditional governance, especially governance by government, can they not avoid altogether?
I think that, well, something that I was just going to add to what you said and what Martin said, I think that this lack of bright light on what the right approach to governance in blockchain is what keeps this gap between the promise and the realization of what blockchain is. So I think that in keeping the idea of like having everything decentralized, uh, they are actually, or like we are actually dismissing the possibility of having an influence of a certain type of governance method, be it a government or be it, I don't know, an influential group that who can actually move things forward and who can actually help in whenever we are falling off the rails. Like for instance, if there weren't any type of governance in online communities, then they would not be as organized as they are. But then, of course, there's the other extreme, as you said, in which do they become actually dictatorships, in which if you don't follow, then you have to get out. So, I mean, all of this, those are the things that I have been, I mean, that keep turning in my head, and actually one of the biggest questions, because it could be that I don't know, and what was the initial vision for the internet, but I'm pretty sure that things didn't turn out exactly 100% as they did, as people imagined it. So I think that we are going to see some sort or form of blockchain, and I'm interested in seeing what that real form of blockchain is in a near future.
So I wanted to share a screen, if I may. So this is I tend to, these days I'm seeing power laws everywhere, you know, maybe it's because I taught a networks course, but you know, this is on Bitcoin, and so it's a power law. It turns out a fairly good power law relationship between the number of commits to blockchain changes and the number of contributors. So you have, you know, a small number of people making a large number of commits, and a large number of people making a small number of commits. We see the same kind of thing in Ethereum, where, I mean, it's not quite as dramatic, but you can still see the same kind of a rough power law type of a relationship. So, you know, again, to Marcella's point, it sort of speaks to these issues of, you know, you've got to have some degree of centralization in order to move these things forward. I was listening to, there was an interview that was done out of the MIT Media Lab. It's on YouTube, where the director of the Media Lab was interviewing some of the current and recent core contributors of Bitcoin in particular. And one of the things that they were talking about was how Bitcoin is different from the regular open source community. And a lot of it has to do with the very immutability of Bitcoin itself, right? Because, I mean, and you know, if you're doing a word processor and you make a code change and a code contribution, it turns out to be a little bit wrong, you can always go back and fix it fairly easily. And it's much harder to do that in blockchain because of this tremendous dependency.
It's a very double-edged sword, permanence versus flexibility. And to plug some more of my own work, in the piece called Constitutions and Blockchains, I say, look, this is a classic governance trade-off in constitutions: rigidity versus flexibility. And the argument being, and this is certainly not my contribution, one of my mentors at UChicago, Tom Ginsberg, and his co-authors showed that there's a pretty tight empirical relationship between how flexible a constitution is and how well it can endure. And so I think that there are interesting lessons there, although I'm also a fan of many of the immutable characteristics of the data stored on a given blockchain. And so I'm not here arguing against immutability, but to be completely unamendable, to be completely unchangeable, Ethereum ran into that problem, as we heard about, with the DAO hack, which is to say, do we want immutability at all costs? Or do we want to be able to publicly punish bad actors on the network? And clearly, for a subset of network participants, immutability was much more important, because from that, Ethereum Classic was born. And so these governance debates, to me, definitely, they surround uncertainty, the unexpected. How well your governance structure can weather an uncertain shock is, to me, the true test of your governance structure. And so do I think Ethereum made the right choice? I don't know. I think I know I don't know enough to answer that question.
They didn't come?
But I can understand the trade-offs associated
I'll
with
tell you.
Ethereum in particular. And so it to me, immutability versus flexibility is a classic governance trade-off. Michael, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, so first of all, hi to Kevin, who I haven't seen in a while, and hi to Lynn. We haven't been in touch on anything in a long while, so it's nice to be at least virtually linked up again in this respect. So I know very little about blockchain and crypto. Hey, Kevin. But just sort of backing out a little bit, there's some ambiguities that are worth paying attention to, right? One is, what do we mean by governance? So in some respects, when we collectively talk about governance, we talk about tools or rules for governing the technology itself. So how is the technology designed? How is it evolved? How is it adapted and so forth? And in different respects, we talk about ways in which technology plus other things are governing or affecting human beings, right? The communities that depend on the technology or build on the technology or what have you. And it's easy to conflate those two things, and they're related to one another. They're not disconnected from one another, but they're kind of different. They have different attributes when we talk about how to analyze strengths and weaknesses. And some of that gets to your observation about the immutability of a blockchain relative to the immutability of an open source software project. So when I was looking at Martin's shared screen about power laws, not only does that reflect how people are committed to blockchain, but also you see similar power law distributions in a lot of open source projects and how people participate in those, and in how managed Wikipedia entries are often managed, right? So super concentrations of very invested people and then diminishing tails of people who are more casually connected. There's something organic to sort of internet engagement that seems to breed a certain distribution that way. The last thing I would say about disambiguating things is that sometimes you want the technology platform itself to be more, not perfectly inflexible, but to be more rigid, to be more fixed. So long as we understand that what we're doing there is focusing on a more infrastructural layer or a more basic layer in whatever the sort of techno-social stack is, right? So you want infrastructures to be stable because people are doing a lot of varied things on top of them. You want a lot of flexibility and variability and heterogeneity to be enabled higher at layers that are sort of more application focused, because the distribution of interest is more varied, commitment levels are more varied, social welfare aspects of them are more varied, right? So there's a the question of fixation versus variability is not a consistent quality all the way through any given governance environment. It's going to have different impacts depending on where you are in the system. I guess the last thing I would say, listening to all of the sort of the intro, is how much of these conversations, I'm happy to say a lot of the conversation has moved to an empirical basis rather than a conceptual or theoretical basis, right? So those of us who were around in one respect or another 25 years ago, it was all champagne and roses and the internet was going to be this magic thing, but no one had any idea how it was actually going to work because the actual test beds were so small. And the people who were involved in those test beds were so ideologically motivated, right? So these super passionate, super committed early adopters who were true believers in many cases in the transformative power in the internet. The questions remain the same, but the lens has changed considerably. And I think that's a really good thing.
I couldn't agree more on the disambiguation about blockchain governance, because when I was taking my short summary notes of all of our speakers, I couldn't decide whether to write it as blockchain governance or governance by blockchain. Because as you've noted, those can mean two very different things depending on your audience. And that's one of the things we intend to disambiguate in our Can Permissionless Blockchains Avoid Governance in the Law? We're like, hey, there's this protocol-based governance. There's this subsidiary governance occurring in most blockchain communities. That was the sort of power law graphs that Martin showed, which is there are subsets of members of these communities who play a really important role in changing the protocol or proposing potential changes to the protocol that are ultimately subject to the consensus mechanism. And so you've got subsidiary, you've got protocol based, but none of these blockchains are existing in a vacuum, which is to say they're competing with one another, at least in certain instances, especially in the realm of cryptocurrencies, such that they're subject to competitive governance forces as well. Finally, the last label, which was, I chose it despite my misgivings about it, was what I called superior governance. My misgivings surround the normative flavor that superior can have, which we didn't intend at all. We were more describing that participants on a particular blockchain, especially to the extent that any of those interactions that are blockchain facilitated surround stores of economic value, are highly likely to be subject to the jurisdiction in which they reside, the laws and regulations of that particular jurisdiction, as well as potentially other jurisdictions in which they're doing business or their interactions on the blockchain implicate. And so all of those are forms of blockchain governance, but we saw actually a need for disambiguation exactly along the lines you described. But it's funny, we actually have never defined governance despite this seminar being devoted to digital governance. So do any of you kind of have a working definition that kind of guides your understanding of this necessarily complex topic?
Only at such a general level that it's not terribly helpful, right? So, I mean, you sort of borrow from some subfield of economics or political theory and say governance is a set of rules by which people coordinate to make decisions, which is a working definition that you see flavors of in social science literature. The only thing I find that it actually does analytically is distinguish sort of collections of systems and rules and norms and formal mechanisms, whether they're public or private or blended, from sort of more conventional sort of legal doctrine and regulation, which is a sub-mode or a specific mode of governance, but it's by no means the entire landscape. So I use governance in that broader sense, mostly to distinguish what I do in my research from what my colleagues do on the law faculty, which is why I hang out with all of you people rather than hanging out with a bunch of other law professors most of the time.
My own identity as a legal scholar is somewhat muddied by my interest in institutions that are both include law, but are by no means limited to law. I kind of wanted to return to a topic Martin raised, which was some measure of centralization in the governance of these communities. He was using the power laws associated with Bitcoin improvement proposals and the number of commits that they got from the Bitcoin community. And that displays a considerable level of centralization. But I somewhat cheekily put in the chat, is it centralization or specialization? I couldn't code an improvement proposal. And so I do wonder which aspects of centralization are not, particularly dangerous or problematic, and which aspects of centralization should we be more leery of, especially in these communities? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I do think in this case it is more centralization than specialization because, again, because of the immutability of blockchains, the control of the software at the core has to be done, has to be strong. I put the link. I finally found the link to that interview. I put it in the chat if anybody wants to watch it. It's not a short interview, so but there are a lot of interesting nuggets in there that talk about, for example, as these Bitcoin improvement processes work their way through, how do they engage with the community of miners, and it's not just a technical issue, it's also a governance issue that we would recognize even from some of the things we saw yesterday in the election, that these are human processes that are all about coming to consensus in some way or another, where you have a variety of interests at play. So I think it is centralization in this case. Now, we could perhaps make an argument in other communities that specialization comes into play, but I don't think it's the case here. But then, if we were thinking, for example, about an application community, we might see more of specialization happening. If it might even be the case in Ethereum that we see that just because it's a Turing complete computing language, and so we might see some people who specialize in one aspect or another. So that's my gut reaction without any data.
I think that's fair. I was kind of poking you a little bit. The context in which I see, at least that's familiar to people in the blockchain and crypto community, surrounding the potential benefits of specialization, but the difficulties that they pose for institutional design in these spaces was the DAO, I believe, had a requirement of 20% support for an investment proposal to get funded by the collectively pooled funds. To my students initially, they're like, that seems crazy low. You're committing your funds and then only 20% of the members of this particular organization have to commit. And participation rates in voting processes are by no means 100%, even in places where it's mandatory. And so there's something to be said about letting other individuals specialize, riding the wave of their costly attention, so to speak. And so I think that there's the potential for specialists in these areas, but what that looks like and how you mitigate the cross-cutting incentives, especially in an automated process, allocating funds for investment projects is, I think, an area that we're going to see a lot more exciting innovation, precisely because we haven't answered all the relevant questions about it.
Something that I think about specialization is that not necessarily it leads to centralization, but I mean, it's not, of course, I agree with Martin's point, but I think that sometimes specialization leads to the need of intermediaries, because when a process becomes too complicated or like too hard to understand, we need someone in the middle who can understand that process or who can help us navigate. So for instance, in the case of blockchain or like Bitcoin, I could not jump directly and start mining and, like fully interacting with the community. If I wanted to take advantage of Bitcoin, I would go through a wallet. And those people who manage these wallets then are the ones who have a better understanding of how the system works. So for me, it's like less of a transaction cost because I do not have to go through the process of understanding and being like proficient in like all of the Bitcoin related world. But then at the same time, there is like the fact that I should trust this intermediate agent who can help me navigate the system. And I think that at that point is when we cannot fully detach blockchain from the concept of intermediaries. Like apparently that's one of the reasons why we have blockchain systems, to get rid of this banks and all of these institutions. But I think that for us to be able to take that advantage is we need someone in the middle to help. And I think that that's one of the consequences of specialization. So yeah, that's a thought that I had.
Well, and actually that, I think this idea of dealing with complexity is a really interesting point, and it actually brings to mind what Lynn was talking about in her talk, because you start thinking about these energy markets. You have a market for local storage and a market for centralized storage, and not storage generation, but then also a separate market for storage. And how do you coordinate these? How do you navigate these? I mean, maybe there's an invisible hand, but maybe the invisible hand is guided by intermediaries.
Well, actually, Lynn's paper is the one that got me thinking about this, and I've done some work on spectrum markets. And when looking at spectrum markets, electricity markets look much better than or much less complex than electricity markets. And in that case, for users to take full advantage of the resources, then there must be a way in which like either we all learn how the market works and we all learn all of the different possibilities of combinations of the resources that are available, or we rely on someone who or some entity that that manages the resources or understands the market better, or like who is the bearer of that invisible hand.
Lynn actually just responded directly. Lynn, do you want to jump in?
No, you know, and especially with the, you know, the Nobel this year and everything, yay. You know, I do think a lot about the similarities and differences between the kind of engineering embedded market design in electricity, the similarities and differences between that and spectrum. And it's, you know, one thing that I've been trying to, in working with my co-authors, trying to encourage is staying away from the combinatorial aspects of spectrum, because holy cow, is that hard.
Yes.
And, you know, electricity is hard enough because, you know, some things happen at the, you know, at the sub 5 second level. And so you have to figure out, okay, what's the time frame on which you want to use markets for governance, and what's the time frame on which you want to use standard straight up engineering control. And, you know, that's hard enough without getting combinatorial.
No, I totally agree about agree on that.
And I think, Lynn, that distinction actually undergirds a lot of the things we've been discussing surrounding which quantities or conditions can you identify and perfectly specify ex ante surrounding if can it be translated into a clean if then statement. And those are areas that I train my students in blockchain and cryptocurrencies, where it's, to me, I'm like, is it highly reliable information, or information that's is surrounding the perfect example of that is a known digital unit of value created by a transparent and knowable rule set on a particular network that you can query to verify all of that. To me, it's great, because these initial use cases surround things whose limits are really well defined in ways that make them very tractable to automated resolution. The other precondition I try to train into my students is, if you don't have mutually distrusting participants, or participants that don't know one another at all and have no way of knowing one another, then I'm not particularly or necessarily in the world where I'm like, a blockchain will solve all of the governance or informational challenges for this particular organization. Because to me, it's, on some margins, a fairly cumbersome network architecture compared to the traditional dictatorial network architecture of many private firms. But if you control a not particularly dispersed private firm today, in particular, I'm not in the camp that thinks a blockchain will bring you too many efficiency benefits on the margins, except as pertains to your interactions inter-firm, not intra-firm. Because but I'd love to be told why I'm wrong. Those are my most memorable days.
You know, that's a great point. You know, I mean, because blockchain in some ways is an expensive way to do an information repository. I mean, we did Pedro, who's on the call here with us right now, did a paper at TPRC last year where he was trying to, among other things, you know, quantify the cost of a smart contract for spectrum sharing application. It'd be kind of a fairly straightforward type of a thing. And it's, I mean, we didn't go so far as to compare it to a centralized database, but I'm going to go out on a, you know, fairly thick limb and say that it was probably cheaper to do it on a centralized database. You know, so I think the real question is, does this higher cost that you pay, is that offset by some advantage of control over information, over trust? I mean, the kinds of things that Kevin was talking about in his book. And I think that's again, from a maybe I'm showing my engineering roots here, but from an engineering kind of a perspective, that's really the essence of the question. What's blockchain good for? And how do you situate it in the context of a larger system?
I was going to add, and I'm going to go back a little bit to what Marcelo was suggesting about the growth of intermediaries as sort of specialized agents, that notwithstanding the ways of Eric, when you did the initial overview of the topics in the seminar as sort of pushing towards sort of a distributed economic and technical system that really, theory of the firm, we have reduction of transaction costs, a lot of automated enforcement of transactions and so forth, so you don't need the traditional firm. But I think in many respects, this conversation we're having now suggests actually the traditional theory of the firm is still very relevant. It's simply that the coordination mechanisms are still important in a complex and techno-economic setting. The firms manifest in different ways. So they don't necessarily manifest in kind of classic old high-rise office building or big office park firms. Uber is still a big company. It just happens to be, widely disaggregated. And I'm thinking about this. I don't think about this a lot in terms of blockchain, but for example, I'm thinking about this right now a lot in terms of sort of pandemic adaptations by professional services firms and all the downtown office towers in Pittsburgh that are now essentially empty because virtually all of the professionals in mostly law firms and some financial services firms, everybody's working at home. It doesn't mean that the firm as a firm is no longer unimportant. In fact, over the course of 6 months, a lot of law firms, the field that I know best, have adapted very successfully and profitably to a full-time work from home mode, so much so that I'm confident that a lot of firms are trying to figure out how to make this strategy essentially permanent because they save a lot on rent, among other things. But it does mean that it puts pressure on a kind of resource coordination, right time, talent, expertise, as well as the technical aspects of things that just needs to get manifested in different organizational structures, management structures, different kinds of expertise have to be added to the system to make it all work smoothly. So I think that there's a generalizable point here. Blockchain is a very tractable case, as you said, because the resources can be specified with a great deal of precision. And then you take that out into the wild in a case where the resource being managed is really labor and time. Not technical units so much as law firms like to take labor and time and turn them into technical units. But it's a much fuzzier coordination problem, but it's essentially the same institutional design challenge, right? Is to take a heterogeneous, distributed, somewhat centralized, somewhat specialized ecology and figure out how to make it productive.
No, I completely agree. And REI abandoned its newly constructed corporate headquarters, or is trying to sell it. I wish they abandoned it. I would go claim it. But effectively, you're seeing that in the West Coast as well, in terms of major corporate entities saying maybe we can do this more permanently. That being said, I think this brings up an important narrative that emerged during Leah's talk, which is, what is the firm or the corporate form all about anyway? Because a risk vector that I see, despite being someone who loves the freedom of working from home generally, and us being able to host a seminar like this and having our speakers return to this session, that's awesome. And frankly, guys, I doubt you would have flown back to Pittsburgh had you spoke once to attend another session in the same series. And so to me, there are huge efficiency gains, but I also wonder, are we not riding the coattails of organizational culture that was developed when we were in person, when we were seeing one another? And so now the people that I've already met, I see them through this Zoom window, and we have all of the benefits of our interpersonal connection that previously occurred. But I've heard from some people who are new hires at places. They feel like they're in an all-team Zoom meeting, and they can tell no one has any idea who they are. And the response to them making a contribution sometimes is like, why is that person talking and who are they? And so I'm sanguine about the transformative nudge that the pandemic will create for this. But I'm playing devil's advocate here. Is there more to bringing people together to physically co-locate, other than the reduction in transaction costs associated with it?
Could I add something to that, which
Please.
is I think there's a related question, because I think the question you're asking is very critical. I think that the related question, to like anchor it in something like blockchain again, for example, is the extent to which these, we've been calling them communities, but that's kind of a loose use of that word as well. So the extent of the community that supports and advances a particular technology or a particular application has a cultural groundedness that helps sort of helps the group cohere. It helps it expresses the commitment to the enterprise, right? So Wikipedia, again, I'm going to come back to the more casual examples that I'm more familiar with, but Wikipedia is as much sort of the collective cultural commitment to the concept of Wikipedia and to the norms of Wikipedia as it is to the specific mechanics of how entries are added, updated, edited, and so forth. Same with open source projects. Same for all of us who are in universities, right? So we've been, for our entire careers as academics, benefiting substantially from the cultural norms that surround the physical presence of our departments and schools and campuses. And for the most part, we're now deprived of that. Like, to what extent does the university as a historic institution sort of survive the transition into something that is considerably more elastic physically and geographically? You asked the same question about disciplines as well as research trajectories and teaching and all of the components of this stuff. I don't know the answer, but I've had the same question in my mind that you asked, which is sort of where does the cultural capital come from when you don't have the ability to interact face to face?
Well, it's interesting. We had, I mean, I think some of it is at the admissions process, right? I don't mean student admission, but when you hire, you're hiring people into a set of values. I mean, so, the story that I have in mind here is back, let's say 10 years ago, give or take, in this, what was then the School of Information Sciences, we were considering a fairly significant type of a transition. Maybe it's a little bit longer ago now, to having a, much more deeply interdisciplinary approach. And it may or may not surprise you, but not all the faculty were totally on board. I was associate dean at the time, so part of my job was to encourage as the best I could to get people to come on board and to participate in this. And I remember a conversation that we had with another one of our peers. This happened to be University of Washington. Their iSchool had this incredible interdisciplinary culture, where it was just a sort of a natural thing for them to do. And so we asked them how they did it, and they said, well, for us it was easy, because we started and we set that as the culture. And we, if you didn't like this, you just wouldn't get hired in. And it just sort of you select people up front into a set of cultural values. Now, is that healthy for an organization? Does it help you move as an organization? I'm not so sure, but I mean, it is a way in which we do that. I mean, we don't hire people into universities as faculty members who are not interested in teaching and research. Not usually anyway.
No, that I think this betokens to me, though, a really interesting question, which is, throughout, we've heard mention of what I like to call transition costs. And so if we compare the efficiency of one system to the efficiency of another system in achieving its objectives, I think it's often, not always, but quite often, relatively easy to say this system is more efficient than this system. But a major concern that emerges in the IBM case study materials I just assigned my students for the blockchain course surrounding how do we get a supply chain network on a blockchain? IBM says, we've got your blockchain, we've got your consultants. What was the biggest concern for most supply chain participants in a few of the case studies was, can it interoperate with our existing cloud and OS? Because absent that ability, we are not interested in upgrading our entire IT infrastructure for the umpteenth time, regardless of the efficiency benefits that you claim will happen. We're concerned about outlay right now. And so I think a big looming question in the background of a lot of this, Lynn's work on, the grid, which is we probably won't get transactive energy at scale until we see some pretty significant changes to our infrastructure, which to me means we've got big transition costs. They might be worth paying for, but I think it's no coincidence that her talk also discussed promising pilot projects in places where that infrastructure wasn't prevalent in the first place. And so to me, I think that there's an important lesson there, which is we see these kind of nascent communities surrounding whatever the new technology is. But the big question is when and how can it scale as a function of the costs it poses to potential adoptees?
Do you
So-
think that, sorry, Martin.
No,
So do you
yeah,
think
go ahead.
that the transition cost has to do with the potential of different technologies to adapt? Like for instance, in this case, we would be talking about the immutability characteristic of blockchain. So if we need to have that as a not negotiable in blockchain, then that's going to limit the evolution of blockchain. And then probably the transition cost is going to be higher than in any of, for instance, like how the different communications platforms have adapted during the pandemic, or like the different processes. So
I would agree with that, which is the more immutable your governance structure, or in this case, your network architecture and the rules that determine processes occurring on that network architecture, the more immutable they are. This is the quintessential challenge in governance. In a non-ergodic world, in one governed by significant uncertainty and complexity, the only certainty is that circumstances will emerge that are ill-suited to the choices you've made in this period. And so I would agree with that characterization, but I'd welcome Martin and Michael's thoughts as well.
So I'd add that the way you were describing the problem, Eric, actually highlighted something that we've mentioned earlier in this call, and I think it continues to be important, which is, and I take it from the reference to Lynn's work earlier, that it was part of the conversation there as well, which is the infrastructure itself, right? So the economics of investing in infrastructure, the economics of developing infrastructure, it's a separate problem. It's not the same problem as figuring out how to invest in and develop and figure out appropriate models for governing sort of sexy applications. So every time I go to a dentist down here I live in the South Hills, every time I go to the dentist and I go to pay, the piece of the bill when I'm leaving, they hand me one of those handheld credit card scanning devices, which, all of us who have been to Europe or other parts of the world, you go to a restaurant, you go to a store, you pay with a credit card, you stick your card in the device that's presented to you. It reads the chip. It's not wired. It's a wireless device. It's essentially ubiquitous wherever I've traveled outside the US, and it is almost unknown in my experience in the US. Now, Pittsburgh is not New York, it's not DC, it's not LA, it's not a super big city. So maybe there's more sophisticated things happening on the two coasts. But here in Pittsburgh, my dentist is reliably the only place I encounter one of those devices. Now, my dentist is kind of a gearhead. So my dentist is always gonna have the sexiest, newest technology. So I'm very grateful for that. But there's a reason for the lack of uptake of these devices in the US, and that's for a combination of legal systems regarding chargebacks in the credit card environment that have slowed the adoption of chip technology, and other things having to do with cartel behavior by MasterCard and Visa. There's a whole variety of sort of infrastructural layers of technology and regulation that have really significantly slowed the rollout of a kind of payments technology that has been rolled out much more successfully and widely because the infrastructural layers in other jurisdictions work in very, very different ways. So I think the point only is not about my dentist or about the payments. The point is that infrastructure matters a lot. There's a lot of different layers of infrastructure, and that talking about governance of infrastructure is its own significantly complicated problem that doesn't get enough attention.
Yeah, I mean, as a matter of fact, that's a whole branch of science technology studies is infrastructure studies, and for those people who are familiar with that literature, I'm only passingly familiar with it, but there's plenty of work to do in that space. People have thought about that.
And the example of the idiosyncrasies between, does the card machine come to your table, or do they laboriously take your card off to some unknown area of the restaurant to process it in some weird guise of privacy? I've never understood that, but I sometimes wonder, what's the lurking omitted variable, in the sense that, and maybe random. And so I'm not claiming, oh, everything has an identifiable cause vis-a-vis the things we care about. But in particular, what your comments brought to mind, Michael, was a table I showed my students yesterday surrounding central bank digital currencies. Ones with a touch point in the EU, whether it be the Bank of England, whether it be the European Central Bank, whether it be some of the Scandinavian countries, or partnerships between countries, only one of which is in the EU. Almost uniformly, all of them used R3's Corda blockchain platform, which is a UK-based company. What you don't see is Hyperledger appearing in those pilot programs of central bank digital currencies. And so the ones you do are the ones that tended to have a closer or potential touch point with the United States in particular, with IBM's Hyperledger. And so what could be interesting is we see the development of what I think is going to be a pretty important technology. I think the initial phases are going to look really weird when it comes to central bank digital currencies, in part because there's so much disagreement about what those should even be defined as. But to me, it's quite possible that we will see that we'll see the development of this technology cutting along geopolitical lines for things that have very little to do with the direct benefits that one potential blockchain platform offer to a central bank compared to another.
So
Go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, what's old is new again, you know, because this is something we've seen in telecommunications over and over and over again.
That's what I was going to say, going to the technology part of this, like going away from the economics or like the currency part of this. This is similar to what happened also when we were adopting cellular technologies. There was this system that was adopted in Europe. There was another one that was adopted in the US, and another one in Asia and the Pacific region. So those finally, we came to a couple of systems that work all around the world, but still the initial development depended on all of these geopolitical also characteristics.
Yeah, and Uruguay's pilot program for its central bank money, to me, is really interesting in terms of what you're describing, which is it's not even on a blockchain. The private wallets are being administered by a state-owned telecom. Because, and I'm not sure I'm sure I'm not in a position to tell them that was the wrong decision, based on looking at the network they already had in place, a public entity controlling that network, and a phone in everyone's pockets. To me, the transition costs of making that state-owned telecom a wallet provider, they probably looked over at, all of the mobile phone money occurring in Africa, and were like, we don't have to get very far to get to that. We already have, notwithstanding the problems with publicly owned network industries. I'm not one to belittle those by any stretch of the definition, but I understand if they're like, hey, we want to get this digital money into everyone's pockets. How do we do that? Oh, we use the publicly owned company that we already control and get it into pockets on the devices that they already have.
So part of the African success of the African telephone currencies was because it was private. It was disassociated from the government, right? Because people couldn't necessarily trust the government currency, but the trading, paying in minutes was a very easy thing, and it was a stable currency that the government couldn't offer. So you do have to be a little bit careful with that example, but I think it's definitely something to think about.
No, I think that's a very fair point, Martin. It was more, I think there's an interesting analogy between the network nature of a telephone network, whether publicly or privately provided, and what else might we be able to layer onto that?
Well, the other thing that the example, both the banking example, the currency example, but also the telecom example highlight is political economy, history, path dependence, right? And whether you're looking at South America or Africa or quite a lot of the history in the US, and I'm no expert in any of these things, but I know enough to know you always have to worry about whose pocket the money ultimately ends up in. As having a big influence on, is it the incumbent phone companies that are going to end up controlling the next generation telecom system, or the post offices owning, the next gen banking system, or so forth. So as a variable in understanding what contributes to success or failure from a governance standpoint, I think that's also a critical element.
Right. As are, things like mercantilist government policies and so on. I mean, arguably, a lot of the development of GSM in Europe was as an attempt to bolster the European telecom industry, which had been sort of left behind in transition to digital, for example, in the telephone arena. There are some interesting cases in Marcella's point brought this to mind, some interesting cases about the technology transitions and infrastructure that had to be made. Again, examples are in telecom because I know the world better, and I don't want to have this be just about telecom, but since I know those cases, when we talk about GSM, there was a time in the early 2000s where it was Bell South, but it later became AT&T, had to ditch their TDMA standard, and they had a choice to make, and they ended up choosing GSM, which was at the time not a 100% obvious choice. I've just a couple weeks ago, I happened to have the opportunity to interview one of the people who was responsible for that decision. So I asked him, well, why did you choose this? And a lot of it had to do with sort of a long-term technology trajectory, attacking being able to address the mobile roaming market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Had less to do with the economics of the infrastructure itself. To me, the more fascinating case of an infrastructure transition was back in the 80s, MCI, the name meant microwave communications. They had this whole network of microwave towers, and they made a very public show of blowing them up and replacing them with fiber. Mike, you're old enough where maybe you remember the ads of MCI, having ads of blowing up the microwave towers. And these were not depreciated. These microwave systems weren't fully depreciated. I always thought that was such a gutsy move, but I've always longed to interview people who were responsible for that decision, because I just wonder how the heck they had the courage to do that.
I think, it can display a level of commitment. I somewhat jokingly analogize proof of work before really hashing it out with my students, pun intended, as, well, what if you went into a bank and they said, look, here's a pile of money we're burning because we want your business. We want your business so badly that we're just setting fire to this pile of money. That's how much money we can make with your business and everyone else's. That's how efficient we are. That's how committed we are. We're just setting this pile of money on fire. And then I'm like, tell me I'm wrong. That's proof of work, isn't it? To make the underlying point that there's an uneasy connection between the electricity expended to ensure network robustness and the specific set of transactions being processed at any point in time. And I think for some people in the crypto world, especially those that are more optimistic about proof of stake, they kind of see proof of work as somewhat equivalent to what I'm describing, which is, wow, you're burning a lot of valuable electricity to achieve this outcome. I'm in the camp that's like, no, it's actually making the network robust because someone has to command, more power than Google's server farms in order to be able to, overtake that network. So that is an important structural feature that burn is getting you. But I see a kind of analogy between MCI saying, like, we're so committed to the new technology, we're blowing up the old one. Come give us your business because we've got the good technology.
So my antitrust professor in law school was Bill Baxter, who was the first head of antitrust in the Reagan administration. And he taught us that predatory pricing did not exist because it was not, it's one of these things that doesn't work in theory, therefore it doesn't work in practice. So that's exactly what I'm hearing when you're describing the, blowing up the towers or burning the money. Is like it, but then again, we have Jeff Bezos and Amazon, and this is exactly what they've done, right? Which is they don't care how profitable, they didn't care how profitable they were. All they wanted was market share. Over the long run, at least at the moment, they seem to have been proved right. So yes, Lynn, Bill Baxter was actually a phenomenal classroom teacher. He came back to Stanford after his tour of duty in Washington, D.C. So I had,
Yes.
He taught me microeconomics.
Well, and I think, Mike, I'm one of my hobby horses and publications is trying to reintroduce the whole idea of quarantine the monopoly into the electric system, right? And that there's only one state in the entire union that has quarantined the monopoly, and that's Texas. But that in and of itself is a governance question, because I think whether we're talking cryptocurrency or the application of blockchain as a platform for some other organization, that all of the things that that have been subjects in this series have really bring up the challenges of vertical integration and vertical disintegration. And I think Leah's paper in particular highlights it really nicely, that the Kosian point, right, that what the kinds of blockchain and so on, those kinds of innovations at the margin, when they change transaction costs at the margin, they change what the quote unquote optimal transactional boundary of the firm should be. And that's a fundamental governance question. And to me, it ties right into Baxter's law.
It's also very Demsetzian. Changes in relative prices tend to change the definition of right structures surrounding those underlying assets of value. And so I like to extend the property scholarship into the more general, because I think there's not quite enough cross-pollination. And so I'm going to do something weird, but hopefully not ineffective, which is first pose a question to our audience members that they can brew on for a few minutes, while I pose a harder question to our panelists. And so the easy question, or the question that I think is easier than the one I'm about to pose, is what topics didn't we cover that we should have? What are areas that are, at the edge of digital governance that you'd like to see explored, where you're like, wow, they really dropped the ball and left that one out? Or where you're just like, hey, this is an exciting new topic that I think is awesome. Because we're hoping to do something like this again, such that I'll gladly collate audience feedback into a roster of new speakers. But my question for the panelists surrounds a question that I struggle with more generally. And Marcella actually raised it earlier in the guise of intermediaries. But I'm going to make it more general. Sometimes it feels like theories of collective action are at war in my head with public choice calculus, which is to say there are considerable benefits to centralizing authority in particular communities. And at its most simple, representative decision-making and collective action decision-making processes do simple efficiencies require some level of delegated representation and some articulation of rules governing the collective decision-making procedure occurring through the guise of those delegated representative agents. And so you need some authority to apply, enforce, and interpret those rules of collective decision-making. So provided you have a group of a sufficient size that not everyone can come together and moot every single question of relevance to that group, you're probably going to see representative decision-making authority. Similarly, you're probably going to see some authority for interpreting, enforcing, applying the rules surrounding collective decision-making for that group. Both of those intrinsically involve some measure of centralization of authority for decision-making in ways that sound very efficient. Then there's an additional argument, which is those whose interests are specifically affected by collective decision-making processes, their voices should certainly be heard. But what's an ugly way of saying what I just said? The rich should have the most influence to all policies because their interests are more implicated by the vast majority of policies out there. So there's huge power concerns associated with people whose interests are deeply implicated when they can't ably represent those interests in the system. So what I'm taking a very long-winded way of asking you is, what is the right level of centralization for a given group? I know that's unanswerable, but how do you kind of adjudicate or referee those boundaries in your own head? When is centralization a natural aspect of collective decision-making? And when is it just subject to capture by the special interest groups that maybe have an outsized influence as opposed to an appropriate influence vis-a-vis their own interests? Because undergirding our entire discussion has been the miracle of decentralization and distributed governance that we're seeing blockchain potentially facilitate. But Marcela noted, there's a lot of intermediaries that I might give my business to. And we're seeing a huge number of intermediaries out there in the blockchain space. And so when is centralization good? When is it bad? How can we tell the difference?
So aren't interest groups just another kind of intermediary that aggregate preferences of certain kinds, right? So I think I would suspect that it has to do a lot to, again, I'm far from a public choice scholar, so you know, take it with a grain of salt, but I would think that it has a lot to do with the cost of aggregating preferences, right? So you know, one of the interesting lessons that came to mind on a totally different matter the other day was, you know, one of the reasons for Amazon's and Netflix's success, for that matter, was that they were able to aggregate, you know, these preferences of people that are far down the tail. You know, there may be, you know, 100, you know, let's say 1,000 people distributed all over the country who are interested in a particular author. The only way to really make it profitable is to find a way to aggregate those preferences and make these vast libraries available, which made it digital, right? I mean, this is Chris Anderson's point in when he was first talking about the fat tails and so on, right? What they did was they reduced the cost of aggregating preferences, and that changed the calculus. I mean, Amazon went a step further and created a platform for aggregating these kinds of preferences over many different kinds of products, you know, which is really the power of Amazon. You know, they created a fulfillment platform that essentially created this kind of an interesting two-sided market. Interesting from my perspective, maybe not from other people's, right? So if the cost of aggregating preferences decreases, I would think that well, I guess if I puzzle it out, just because you can aggregate preferences doesn't mean that the preferences can be resolved well, right? So at some point, maybe you do need the Hobbesian Leviathan to come in and say, this is how it's going to be, end of story, you know? That's kind, you know, I mean, you had a remark about the election before. We just kind of finished a process of trying to figure out, you know, how to aggregate our preferences to decide on, you know, on a collective group of people who are going to represent us for better or worse, right? If we could do that more cheaply, would we have more civic engagement or less? I don't know. Again, this is way outside of my expertise, so I can't really even speak to it.
I'd add one tiny wrinkle before hearing from Michael and Marcelo, which surrounds constitutional boundaries on the aggregation of preferences. Because if aggregation of preferences is the sort of ultimate arbiter of good governance, I would agree with everything you said, Martin. But it sounds like Leah is also wanting to jump in on this point.
Oh, sorry, Eric, you can finish. I wanted to jump in.
Oh, no, I made my
You can
point,
go ahead
which
and
was
finish. Oh.
Aggregation of preferences within constitutional boundaries. Otherwise, I agree with everything Martin just said.
Yeah. So I wanted to share your question because I don't have an answer, but I often I think about it like, so similar question, just I frame it in my head is there a good framework to evaluate whether the value of discovery that we get from kind of more decentralization will be better or worse than the value of having standardization and thus potential scale from centralization. And so I bring this up too because I was doing interviews with like some technology startups, and we did surveys, and and we asked them questions about regulation, and I noticed that a lot of them were talking about, well, it would be better if regulations for fintech and some of because some of the fields they were dealing with were state by state regulation. So they thought like it would be better if the regulations were more centralized, and that would help them with the process of innovating and scaling and going, instead of having to go state by state to get like a different, I don't know, banking charter from each state and so on. And I often thought about this because I think it is at odds in a way. Like we, and Lynn Ostrom's work, for example, like we can think about it like as a bit of a framework, like is because she and Buchanan, for example, talk about like, is it the extent of the externality that we're trying to capture by scaling up versus down? But also think about it this way, like would you want like 50 different FDAs? You know, when the fintech companies kind of presented the problem to me like this, they said, you know, we would much rather have one regulating body just tell us what we need to do rather than go to 50 different states or different localities and figure out like, okay, this says this says that, this says, you know, something else. So I just wanted to kind of add a bit to that I've been thinking about it as well. And I think it's a good question. And maybe we can discuss a bit like what is the framework, right, for evaluating whether the value of discovery will be better or worse than the value of standardization and thus scale, or centralization, as you know.
No, I agree. I'm in search of that framework. If you've got the perfect one, plug and play, I'm your customer. But Michael, Marcela, anything to add?
Just quickly, I think that two quick observations. One is that power comes in a lot of flavors and gets expressed in a lot of ways. And when we're thinking about governance, whatever level of governance we're thinking about, governance of the technology, governance by the technology, we have to be really attentive to all of the different ways in which power might be manifest and power might be affecting the dynamics. So that's just the one observation. And I think that's just, it's a sort of obvious, but it's also, it sometimes sort of disappears because, and lawyers are as guilty of this as anyone else, you end up focusing on the structure and sort of the formal logic of governance or the formal logic of technology, and you lose track of some of these sort of softer concerns that are kind of sometimes more hidden than they should be. The second is that so the way you pose the initial conflict, Eric, I sometimes hear an echo, and it's probably a subconscious or unintentional echo of the idea that sort of legitimate governance is modeled on some form of democratic practice, right? So we've got sort of one person's preferences, they get aggregated as if each preference counts the same. You add that up in a legitimate, transparent, accountable, and replicable way, and then you've got something that's okay. And so, you know, Leah mentioned Ostrom. I've done a lot of work with her research, and you know, there's a lot of high functioning, legitimate community governance of resources in a lot of different spaces that don't operate on that sort of formal democratic theory model. And so I think we also need to be imaginative and creative in thinking about how to apply large concepts like legitimacy and efficacy and efficiency and accountability without necessarily anchoring them in a very specific conception of what sort of community participation looks like.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Marcela? Or
Yeah, when we talk about aggregation of preferences, I cannot help but think of matching markets, and that's yay another Nobel Prize winner. So I think that that level of aggregation of preferences and given by a market is pretty important, and that kind of like has led to the finding standards for several practices. Like for example, for the match process for doctors. And if we left that decision to just like doctors and hospitals, we just like end up with markets that are not going to be viable, because you end up with hospitals reaching out for students, for medical students when they are in their first year, just because they are very promising, but you never know what that person is going to look like 5 years from now. So I think that all of this in this case, I think that the market acts as an intermediate entity to bring together these two different sets of people, or two different set of institutions, and that actually is able to manage the level of power and influence that different entities have. So for instance, in that case, like if we have a very big hospital reaching out to different students and it has a high reputation, then probably students are going to go to that. And then other places that really need people there are going to be underrepresented. Also, if we have an intermediate agency that gathers the preferences of smaller players in the market, for instance, they may have a better chance of standing up to, I don't know, to bigger companies like an Amazon, or in the telecom world, an AT&T or a Verizon, which would not be the case if they were to participate directly in a one-to-one competition for assets or for anything that they are looking for. So I think that this doesn't necessarily need to be centralized, because this is just an entity that helps you get to a better set of options that you wouldn't have if you were to act alone. And you can have multiple of these different markets operating at the same time. So it's distributed, but then at the same time, it's not fully decentralized, because you, and I'm sorry, not because, but in that way, you are avoiding all of the complications and all of the congestion that can result in that way. And I think that in blockchain, this would apply as well, because if we were to all try to understand how to get on the Bitcoin train, it would be much more difficult than relying on the multiple sets of wallets that we have right now.
No, and I think you've both raised two fundamental questions when designing a network to achieve its intended purposes. And guess what? When you're doing that, you're talking about governance. Marcela, I see a lot of mechanism design in what you're describing, which is how can we better, aggregate preferences in this market to represent this set of constituents that we don't want underrepresented. But Michael, I see you as raising legitimacy. What form legitimizes this particular network structure? But the two questions are not inseparable, because the example I use to my students to motivate why the proof of work consensus mechanism is structured the way it is why not just one computer, one vote? Why not just, that seems really democratic. Why do we have all of this processing power? Until I mentioned to them that you can partition a computer and make it look like it's 100 computers joining the Bitcoin network. And so there's actually a structural problem that prevents a particular legitimizing technique from even being viable given that network's intended functions. And so, Leah, it looked like you might have another thing to say. Oh, you're good? Okay. So I see people jumping off, and we've got 4 minutes left.
So, Marcella, one thing that you just said that kind of brought back, so you were talking about, smaller players aggregating to be able to compete with a large market power. Well, this is exactly what the small computer manufacturers were doing in the 1980s when they created the OSI reference model. So they're using the legitimacy of the International Standards Organization to aggregate their preferences so that they could compete against IBM. So it's interesting. I never thought of it that way, but I think that's an interesting way to frame it.
So with our final minutes remaining, any topical wish list, either from our audience members or from our panelists? Anything we should have covered but didn't, or that you want to hear about next time?
I mean, I think this issue of intermediaries is really rich, and probably deserves a little bit more oxygen. I think that would be one thing. The other, I don't know how much we want to move into some of the internet governance issues. I mean, that's going to become increasingly important as we go forward. And I think there's some, especially Ilya has some connections on some reservations where, we can start looking at alternate forms of governance in, let's say, in the digital domain. I think there's some interesting stuff there if we wanted to go into that direction.
Completely agree. I think the issue of content moderation isn't going anywhere. It's certainly a salient issue, and the different methods we're going to employ, whether digital or human based, whether some combination of those two, and are there appeal processes? Should there be transparency in rules? It seems like a quintessential governance question as our discussions are moving increasingly into this digital realm.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think there's a big question about who should be doing it, right? I mean, I think asking Facebook to be their own content moderators is a recipe for disaster, for example. I mean, they're,
But we haven't asked them, Martin. They volunteered.
well, same difference, right? I mean,
but it's actually, I completely agree that kind of all the governance, the empirical questions, the theoretical questions that surround what Facebook is doing and why are really, really interesting and important. But I also think it's important, and we had, I don't know if you know, Kate Klonick, who's a law professor at St. John's, who's been studying this. She gave a talk to our faculty last week on a paper that she's publishing in the Yale Law Journal. And I asked her, is Facebook an N of one, which was kind of, I was kind of lobbing a question in her direction to get her to talk about how Facebook is a really powerful case study, but it's not the only example of large complex system design when it comes to some intermediate mechanism, not just for content. I do think what Amazon does to police its platform for IP questions, what eBay does. I mean, all of these large platform companies now have internal, privately designed sort of semi-autonomous governance systems for sort of reviewing the adjudication that goes on within them. It's very like insurance companies. If you've got a homeowner's claim or an automobile claim, your insurance company now has an algorithmically determined claim mechanism. This is just a fascinating territory to understand the system design, the legitimacy questions, the accuracy issues, how much of it can be coded, should be coded, how much of it should turn into smart systems of one sort or another. I think because of the First Amendment implications, Facebook is a high priority, but I think it opens the door to a lot of really, really large scale questions. Once, because we've taken the government significantly out of these equations.
Well, it gets into some of the automated adjudication things that you and I have talked extensively about too. And I think that would be another interesting direction for us to be going.
That got me thinking that, for instance, in the case of how YouTube regulates its content, it has a lot to do with existing rules, like for instance, like copyright and those types of rules. But then in the case of Facebook, it goes into this gray area because there is the issue of freedom of expression versus, adding misleading information and the consequences of that. And of course, like another whole set of issues with that. So I think that would be really interesting.
And on YouTube, the copyright police on YouTube are significantly automated. So an enormous amount of that is done by algorithms, whereas but there's more human involvement on the copyright side. On the pornography side, it's just about 100% automated. There's less involvement because you have less of a rule set to rely on. At least copyright, you've got a rule system to rely on. You can build code, but one of the things that the copyright system requires, by the courts have ruled, you have to have humans involved on the copyright side. You don't have a similar rule set to rely on the pornography side. So it's much easier to automate nudity, you're out. And you can automate that relatively straightforward way. So it's interesting to see how different, one platform has implemented different governance for different subject matter.
So famously, right, you know it when you see it. So now it's the AI knows it if it sees it, right?
That's true.
Otter Stewart in the machine. That would be a great title for a journal article somewhere.
Well, on that note, we're actually over our half an hour of flex time. So hopefully we can continue this conversation in another seminar series, because this has been loads of fun. And so unless any of our panelists today have any closing remarks, I think we can leave it here.
Right.
Thanks, everyone. This has been so
Thank
much.
you.
Great
Thank
semester.
you, Eric.
This was a
Thank
lot of
Thank
fun.
you, Eric, for all your efforts
Thank
to
you.
organize this. I
Yeah,
appreciate
you're
it.
very welcome.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.